If you've been following my channel, you know I love dungeon crawlers. I just love to capture the magic, the adventure of going into a dungeon with a party of adventurers, loot, monsters, exploration, random dice stuff, traps, more loot, more treasure, more leveling up, and an epic boss fight. I'm absolutely sold on that. So this leads to today's question, drawing from the different dungeon crawlers that I have. And I'm going to give a couple of examples and, of course, turn it over to you, my fellow dungeon crawler enthusiasts, what you think of some of the titles in your collection or things you've been looking at. Let's talk about the tiles, the terrain. I mean, the actual map of the dungeon. That's like 80% of it. It's a dungeon crawler. We want to have that representation in the dungeon. Some do it very well, some not so well, some didn't even make the effort from that perspective. So this idea in a dungeon crawler of assembling tiles and literally building out the dungeon, building out the playing field. And sometimes it's a small snapshot of the dungeon. Some dungeon crawlers, let's look at Descent 2nd Edition, a favorite title in my collection. The dungeons and scenarios tend to be very, very small and modular. The idea that they're linked together and you're playing them. Compare that to Descent 1st Edition, also a favorite of mine. Some of those dungeons are massive. So we see some systems that can be small, some that can be large, somewhere in between. The first real question in my mind is random dungeon placement versus a fixed map. Systems that say, here's the fixed map that the DM is going to lay out ahead of time, or the GM is going to lay out ahead of time, or they're going to build it, and as the players discover, they're looking at like a quest book and they're laying out the tiles. And then versus a random map that spawns random pieces that you play, either with an overlord or a GM / necromancer controlling the minions, or perhaps as a total co-op. Generally speaking, I prefer the random. I do, not only for replayability, but I prefer the random for an in-the-moment, like, this is what spawned. It's like a puzzle. How are we going to unlock it? How are we going to do it? Now, the tiles themselves, let's draw 3 from my collection. Dungeon Saga by Mantic. Some awesome miniatures, actually some really excellent scenarios. I have to say, the core quests, they're really well done. And even after you've kind of played through them once or twice and you know where things are going to spawn, or at least initially how things are going to place, the Overlord cards, the Necromancer cards, and the way you can control new spawns and place stuff, there's a lot of tactical replayability. So I enjoy playing Dungeon Saga where, yes, it has those elements of a dungeon crawler, but it also wants to play as a very light, tactical dungeon brawl. But the tiles themselves are just uninspiring. The design is basically square and a few odd ones. And very, very bland. It's supposed to be an undead hold, a Dwarf King's hold, drawing from that first line. A lot of dark ink, a lot of dark colors, washed out, texture not that great. It's almost like, what are we really playing on? It's almost like I want to pull tiles from another system and utilize those. So I want to be inspired by the tiles. They're like 90% of the game. They're the literal foundation where we're going to place the doors and the traps and the treasure and the miniatures. So I want that vibrancy. Now, Descent 2nd Edition, I think, has a good mix of tiles, of generic tiles. Some are big, some are small, some are connectors. But the artwork on it, various dungeon holds, various ruins. There's outdoor dungeon tiles. For now, we'll just kind of lump that in as a generic dungeon type thing. They do a solid job. They do a solid job of evoking this feeling of, hey, we're in a dungeon and here's where we're playing. At least the minimum of that. But I have to say, the system that I like the most, the original, Hero Quest. I like Hero Quest in that you literally have a fixed board, fixed rooms. It's the same thing every single time. Here is the board. It does a nice job of knowing this dungeon that we're playing, it's never going to go beyond these boundaries. It makes setting things up and focusing the play really, really interesting. From that perspective, I know as I build the dungeon out, if I'm playing the Overlord, it's not going to start like here and then randomly go off the table. I mean, we had a dungeon spawn once where we didn't have much space and it was moving off towards the right. And halfway through the game, I realized I should have aligned it the other way. I aligned it for myself. I should have flipped it for the players because now we're literally running off the table. And we were at a gaming store. So we propped up a bunch of gaming cases and put like this flat board to continue it off the table. I didn't dare reset it. So with HeroQuest, the board is fixed. When you add in different doors and different elements from that perspective, then from there, not only is there a ton of combinations, but it gets very, very complex. I kind of like that simplistic system. And I kind of wonder why nobody else has done it. Well, maybe because HeroQuest has done it. And there's this feeling that HeroQuest being kind of the first DNA of a dungeon crawler, we don't want to copy it somehow. The best, in my opinion, and we're not talking about, we're talking about stock, right? Obviously, you can take any of these dungeon systems and kind of do the 3D terrain and 3D printed terrain and custom wargaming terrain. That's taking things to a new level. We're talking about just kind of out of the box. Check out online, Google Images, whatever, Blackstone Fortress, Warhammer 40,000 Blackstone Fortress. This is interesting because Blackstone Fortress is this idea of this, it's a dungeon crawler in space, this idea of this gigantic space station that various factions in the Warhammer 40,000 universe are trying to raid and take over and explore. So you have adventurers going in to loot. It's kind of a dungeon crawler in space, very interesting. But the tiles themselves are not only not just like generic squares, they're like geometric shapes. The artwork, some of them are like crystallized, some of them are alien tech walls. Some of them are a fusion of explorer tech, like they were trying to get into some vault and stuff has kind of been ruined. The artwork is really vibrant. It really pops. It's got some interesting colors, some purples and greens and different hues that aren't used. Now, I know it's a sci-fi type setting, but it works extremely well. And it's very, very interesting. It's very interesting with how it works. So I have to say that's probably the most visually appealing and interesting setup of a modular system that you're going to arrange. But going back to HeroQuest, going back to the first, there is a lot of beautiful simplicity in that one board. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Dungeon crawlers where the tile system itself just did not work. You're like, the system is pretty good actually, but the tiles are awful and we need to do something about them. And then a system where you say, look, gameplay for the sake of this discussion doesn't matter. Here's how it looks. Here's how it pops. It's really, really interesting and dynamic from that perspective.